We are live.
Welcome to the conference, Walking in the Light of Fratelli Tutti and Laudato Si. My name is Marita Grutson, and it's my pleasure to introduce Mary Ryan Hotchkiss, who will moderate this panel on immigration at the southern border of the U.S. Mary Ryan Hotchkiss, after raising a family, receiving a PhD in chemistry from Oregon State University, and working in high tech, now concentrates her retirement on working for peace and justice. As an active Maryknoll affiliate for almost 30 years, she has held the roles of affiliate board member and chair, co-editor of the newsletter, regional coordinator, and chapter contact person. Mary's volunteer activities have included hosting the Search for Peace art exhibit, teaching English as a second language, and organizing events on nonviolence for the Maryknoll affiliates, for Oregon Peace Builders, and the Spirit of Grace Church in Beaverton, Oregon. She and her husband, Manny, enjoy connecting with many Maryknollers and affiliates in Tanzania, Peru, Guatemala, El Salvador, Mexico, and across the U.S., always alert for the stories that she could include in the affiliate newsletter, Not So Far Afield. Welcome, Mary. Please pick up from here.
Thank you, Marita. That was a long introduction, but thank you. And I welcome everyone to this session on immigration at the southern border of the U.S. I welcome you on YouTube from wherever you are currently sitting in the world. I'm currently sitting in Tucson, Arizona, although I'm from Portland, Oregon. Here, I'm surrounded by the color and vibrancy of immigrants. Wherever we are, immigration and immigrants touch all our lives. The world is in movement. Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti says, the stories of migrants are always stories of an encounter between individuals and between cultures. Our amazing panel today has encountered immigrants and has heard their stories. Our speakers have wide and deep experience and expertise concerning immigrants and immigration. They will touch on humanitarian, legal, moral, and cultural issues. Be prepared to be informed and inspired by the presentations. This panel on immigration at the southern border of the U.S. will last for 2 hours. Each panelist will have about 20 minutes for their presentation. Then we will have some time for discussion about what they've presented. Those of you on YouTube are invited to make comments or ask questions through the chat function at any time during the presentations. I will direct your questions to our panelists in the final portion of our session. Now we will continue our journey of encounter and understanding of immigrants and immigration with our first speaker. Our first speaker is Deidre Griffin, SSJ Esquire. Her presentation is God's Call to Radical Hospitality. She is a sister of St. Joseph and a Maryknoll lay missioner and a volunteer attorney working at Las Americas Immigration Advocacy Center and also working at the Annunciation House, a busy lady. The Annunciation House provides hospitality to migrants in El Paso, Texas. I welcome Sister Deirdre and her presentation, God's Call to Radical Hospitality. Sister?
Thank you very much, Mary, and thanks to everyone for the invitation and for taking time to be together for this kind of sharing. I am actually in Casa Papa Francisco, which is the most newly opened shelter as part of the Annunciation House network. And so I apologize if things might get a little loud in the background at times. We'll hope for the best. And also just want to let you know that I do not have slides, but I do have links to the websites for most of the references in what really is more of a personal reflection. So I'm just going to go ahead and drop those in the chat. So you can feel free to look to any of those resources for more information. It's a lot. So part of the invitation to reflect is my gratitude for the opportunity to kind of connect the dots and integrate some of this for myself as well. So go ahead and begin. To share that as a sister of St. Joseph with a background in immigration law, I asked my community to mission me to the US-Mexico border. Not because I felt that I had any solutions, but because I felt deeply drawn to move beyond the political and legal and social polarities that have become so extreme in the US that they paralyze any comprehensive national efforts to engage the situation humanely. I had reached a point where personally my only way forward was a deeper dive into the gospel, to bring my body and my soul, my professional training, and my daily energy to the foot of the cross here in El Paso, at the service of people who are suffering as they make their treacherous journeys to the United States. My community said yes, and thankfully so did Maryknoll missioners, who welcomed me to join our border region community here in El Paso, Texas last year. I arrived with a deep faith in God's radical hospitality, based in my Catholic tradition and in my experience working in refugee resettlement in Western Massachusetts. Through my work with Jewish Family Service there, I had the privilege of working with a team of 28 caseworkers from all over the world, from Somalia, Bhutan, Iraq, Sudan, Russia, Congo, Rwanda, Iran. And together we held a cultural, linguistic, and a religious diversity that broke down any tendency to prioritize any one perspective over another. And it really demanded a starting point of very intentional hospitality in every encounter if we hope to make any progress at all. So cups of tea and coffee with cardamom and sharing sweet bread quickly became foundational, because this work really is dependent upon relationships and on building up the trust that allows people to be vulnerable, to be generous, to receive and to give, and to be creative. Because what we need is to cultivate spaces of mutuality where real healing and transformation can happen, and can happen for all of us, not just the people who are seeking safety, but for everyone. And that, I think, is the key that we in the United States so often miss. We get dulled by external motivations like economic growth and efficiency and independence and even charity, I would say. We are just utterly ignorant as a society that our own well-being, personally and collectively, is wrapped up in the well-being of other people and of Earth herself. I think one consequence of this is that we don't adequately consider the complexities of the realities of the people who are fleeing their homes and seeking safety at our southern border. And Pope Francis poignantly invites us to see that complexity more clearly in Laudato Si. He writes in paragraph 49, "This is due partly to the fact that many professionals, opinion makers, communications media, and centers of power, being located in affluent urban areas, are far removed from the poor, with little direct contact with their problems. They live and reason from the comfortable position of a high level of development and a quality of life well beyond the reach of the majority of the world's population. This lack of physical contact and encounter can lead to a numbing of conscience and to analyses which neglect parts of reality. At times, this attitude exists side by side with a quote unquote green rhetoric. Today, however, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. These intersecting concerns present themselves without ceasing at the border here in El Paso. For as Pope Francis also says in Laudato Si, the human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together. We cannot adequately combat environmental degradation unless we attend to causes related to human and social degradation. And I'd like to share just a few illustrative stories from my encounters just this past week here in El Paso. A young man named Erwin left his family in rural Guatemala with a broken heart and deep determination. Climate change has disrupted the family's generations of surviving on subsistence farming, leaving them with insufficient food for his parents, his disabled sister, and himself. Treacherous conditions in Mexico resulted in Erwin's being beaten and robbed multiple times along his journey, and ultimately he was kidnapped by human traffickers while waiting to cross into the United States. A second gentleman named Tuba from Senegal, he was ostracized from his family and beaten multiple times by community members following his conversion from Christianity to Islam. He fled seeking safety in the US and was held in immigration detention for over 4 months with no access to communication with anyone in his first language of Wolof. Thanks to advocacy from Las Americas Immigration Advocacy Center attorneys, he has been released and is now in New York pursuing his asylum claim. And last but not least, Luis Angelis, an 11-year-old girl from Guatemala, with her mother and her 4 younger siblings. Each afternoon between 3 and 4, her emotions spill over in ways that she cannot control, expressing her fear, her suffering, and her anger following the physical and emotional assaults she's endured to get here. And yet, as these emotions subside, she creates beautiful mandalas. So these are glimpses into the stream of sacred stories that make their way through the Annunciation House Shelter Network each and every day. The hospitality we're able to provide is very simple and transitional. We provide guests with assurance of their safety and their liberty, along with food and shelter and assistance connecting with family members whom they'll travel to join as soon as possible while their deportation cases play out in immigration court. This is not a comprehensive solution, but it helps to ease the pain of those whose suffering necessitates making the journey now. Unfortunately, what most people experience when they present themselves to the US government at the border is the antithesis of God's hospitality. Rather, today, Title 42 continues to preclude people from exercising their right to asylum under international law, and to subject tens of thousands of people to very harsh living conditions in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, both in terms of housing and exposure to violence and exploitation of all kinds. In addition, most people who manage to cross the Rio Grande into El Paso will spend some period of time, averaging from 2 days to 4 months, in US immigration detention custody. As you may know, the United States government contracts with over 200 public and private prison facilities to hold people who enter the United States without permission. This penal approach to what is truly a global humanitarian crisis is undeniably an outgrowth of the deeply racist roots underlying incarceration of all kinds in the United States. This reality was painfully apparent during the early days of the war in Ukraine here in El Paso. As thousands of dark-skinned people from Latin America, Asia, and Africa languished, awaiting humanitarian solutions on the Mexican side of the border. Orderly lines of white Eastern Europeans from Ukraine moved efficiently toward the border to welcome people fleeing the war. We continue to hear horrific stories of people from Haiti being turned away from shelters in Mexico because of the color of their skin. And a recently released report from the organization Freedom for Immigrants documents the disparate treatment of people of color within US detention centers. This strategy of imprisoning people seeking safety has become entrenched in the US immigration enforcement mindset since the 1980s. Many of these facilities are maximum security prisons that fail to meet even the minimum standards for space, medical care, and language access that are laid out in federal contracts. Accounts of mistreatment and unsanitary conditions are rampant, and there are ongoing advocacy efforts to shut the system down. At Las Americas, we ground our legal work with people in detention within the larger context of abolition, the abolition of all forms of imprisonment and oppression of people. I wonder, what will it take for us to acknowledge the truth rather than remain numb in the face of such exorbitant, publicly funded violence? We know that community-based welcome of immigrants is better for everyone, the immigrants themselves, the communities that receive them, and the local economies that are desperate to employ them. It is well documented that this approach is much less expensive and that immigrants welcomed in this way have a higher rate of complying with immigration court processes. Yet just today here in El Paso, received word that Border Patrol has constructed an additional soft-sided tent facility to increase holding capacity by another 2,100 people per day. Here at Annunciation House, we take this as an indication that more people are expected to arrive at the border soon and subsequently be released to our network of shelters for transitional support. We're always in need of volunteers, so please do consider coming to join us and encourage others to do the same. Even if it's just for a couple of weeks through Annunciation House, or perhaps through a border immersion experience with a group like the Encuentro Project, you could also reach out to your local refugee resettlement agency or connect with Jesuit Refugee Service, which is working to connect folks who are willing to offer hospitality to newcomers around the country. These acts of solidarity will change your life forever, and you will become part of developing the more humane solutions we have yet to create. And lastly, a word about the hospitality of the greater El Paso community. El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico function as one binational community across the Rio Grande River. Thousands of people cross the border each day to go to work, to go to school, to visit their families. And the local community has more than its own share of struggles, while constantly receiving folks from the border with open arms and open hearts. Employment opportunities and the health of the local environment have been decimated by changes in manufacturing and the imports industry under NAFTA. And one group that has organized within the community is called La Mujer Obrera, the working woman. Their mission inspires me, and their participation in the Encuentro Project gives me great hope, as their reference for Indigenous roots and wisdom aligns with what Pope Francis is teaching afresh through the Catholic lens in Laudato Si. The violence done by institutions, including the Catholic Church, is part of the complexity that we must learn to be more honest about if we hope to heal and move forward together. And this is how La Mujer Obrera describes their work. Our efforts are grounded in the belief that we are a part of nature and part of a lineage of earth-based cultural practices and wisdom that are key to restoring balance and health, not only to our community, but to the soil, plants, insects, and animals with whom we share Earth. This is why our resistance work is multifaceted and interconnected. We resist by organizing against injustice and by building alternative systems that nourish our community. We resist a system that dehumanizes us and continuously works toward establishing alternative models, along the way learning to heal our relationship with each other and with the land. And Pope Francis also calls us to hope and action in Laudato Si. He writes that for all our limitations, gestures of generosity, solidarity, and care cannot but well up within us, since we were made for love. Viable future scenarios will have to be generated between the extremes, since there is no one path to a solution. And in closing, personally, I can't help but think of the gospel story of the woman who comes to the Pharisee's house uninvited to wash the feet of Jesus with her tears of gratitude and to dry them with her hair. From Luke's gospel, Jesus said to Simon the Pharisee, "Do you see this woman? When I came into your house, you gave me no water for my feet, but she washed my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. You gave me no kiss of a greeting, but she has been kissing my feet since I came in. You did not put oil on my head, but she poured perfume on my feet. I tell you that her many sins are forgiven, so she showed great love. But the person who is forgiven only a little will love only a little." As a country, we have so very much for which to beg forgiveness. The least we can do right now is to offer a similarly heartfelt hospitality of reverence to the neighbors arriving in our midst. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Deirdre. Thank you so much. Very touching. So our second speaker today is Heidi Cernecka, who is also a Maryknoll lay missioner and immigration attorney. Her presentation is entitled "A Tip of the Iceberg: Why Immigration at the U.S. Border is Not the Real Issue," although Sister Deirdre brought up many other issues which are interchanged. As a Maryknoll lay missioner and an immigration attorney at Las Americas, I hope that Heidi will also tell us a little bit more about Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Program. Heidi has worked in Brazil, Kenya, and for the last few years, the Mexico border in El Paso, Texas, at the intersection of women, criminal justice, and migration. I welcome Heidi with her talk, "A Tip of the Iceberg: Why Immigration at the U.S. Border is Not the Real Issue." So I hope that Heidi will be highlighted for her talk. Marita, can you check on that?
Thanks so much. Thanks, Mary. It's perfect timing to follow Deirdre. As Deirdre talked about institutional reality and all that we do need to do here at the border, and I'm going to go beyond that. I might share a few slides. We'll see. Oh, wait, hang on, see? Let me make it a full-on PowerPoint and then do that. Okay. Take two. Okay. Are you seeing the title slide, "A Tip of the Iceberg"? Okay.
Yes, we are.
Just because you're an attorney at the border doesn't mean that you are good at technology. Much like Deirdre was talking, I thought, you know, we do resist. We were made for love. I love all of that. I love the call to be a community-based, welcoming community for immigrants. And I really was looking at where Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti, the call to environmental questions, and migration all come together. And I thought, this is a call to action. Just like Deirdre said, this is a call individually, collectively, in our communities, in our churches, it's an invitation to really live our gospel call. And, Pope Francis says, we need to develop the awareness that nowadays we are either all saved together or no one is saved. Poverty, decadence, and suffering in one part of the earth are a silent breeding ground for problems that will end up affecting the entire planet. And the starting point for this is looking at the right not to emigrate, the right to stay in a person's homeland. To only look at the southern border of the United States is like looking at the end of the line of a life of injustices and challenges and difficulties. And so in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis also says, all people have the right to a dignified life and integral development in their own home and native land. This entails all of our responsibility to assist poorer homelands to flourish. The investments they need are not only sustainable economic development, but also combating poverty, hunger, disease, environmental degradation, and climate change. This is about where the change has to start, besides in our hearts. Catholic teaching also states that the root causes of migration, poverty, injustice, religious intolerance, armed conflicts have to be addressed so the migrants can remain in their homelands. And that was a joint statement of the US and Mexico bishops that was issued 20 years ago, which really, is heartening and disheartening that we don't seem to have learned. Pope Pius XIII, I promise I'm not going to keep spouting quotes from ages ago, but Pope Pius XIII that I had to look up, who was Pope from 1938 to 1958, actually said the elimination of global underdevelopment is the antidote to irregular immigration. That was, I don't even can do math. That was like years ago. And so we really need to roll back and think, and what is our part in that, and what can we do? The UN High Commissioner for Refugees said that 1 out of every 88 people on the earth has been forced to flee their home. Many who eventually try to go home get displaced again. The obvious solution for internally displaced people, those are people that are still in the bounds of their own country, but no longer in their home, or refugees who have left their country, or citizens, is to lift people out of poverty. When we think about like what somebody who chooses to leave their home, either out of fear, because of violence, out of hope for a better life, what they leave behind. Again, Pope Francis says, those who emigrate experience separation from their place of origin and often a cultural and religious uprooting as well. Fragmentation is also felt by the communities they leave behind, which lose their most vigorous and enterprising elements, and by families, especially when one or both of the parents migrates, leaving children in their country of origin. Again, the reason to think about the right not to emigrate. There are durable solutions. And so much like Deirdre, I wanted to think about a few of the people that I've met along the way in my time here in El Paso as an immigration attorney. One of them was a young man, Jose Domingo from Guatemala, whose family had lived on their land for generations. And the men started to organize because corporations came in and started paying to change titles and to make it look like the families didn't have their own right to the land. And so the men started organizing and things started getting violent. And Jose Domingo left. That's environmental. And I would actually also say that's about power and greed. And those are our invitations and challenges today. And I think those are our institutional invitations. Those are our national challenges, but those are also the challenges that I'm going to actually put to each one of us. Pope Francis said, as Deirdre said, the earth is suffering from the violence of indifference and domination, war, militarization, destructive extravasation, like they just the extraction of minerals from the earth in ways that are not healthy for the actual earth, nor for the community around them. There are indigenous communities in the north of Brazil who all their lives, all their families' history have been fisher people. They've lived on the rivers and fished. They respect the fact that there's a time of year we can't fish because the fish need to replenish, because that's the cycle of the system. But private economic interests have come in and have started just fishing year round, which is reducing the fish and making it impossible for people to do simple sustenance in their communities. Laudato Si talks about the tragic rise in the number of migrants seeking to flee growing poverty because of environmental degradation. I just saw a statistic that said 23.7 million people in 2021 were internally displaced because of climate issues in 1 year. Some of those are natural. We have droughts, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, overfishing, strip mining, mercury poisoning of water, deforestation. When I lived in Brazil, I'll never forget going up to the Amazon area for something and passing acres and acres and acres of grazing land and looking at all of that land and thinking all of this was forest for wood or for beef. Monocropping, eucalyptus trees that strip the land. So sure, it's possible to argue that some of this is necessary because the population on the planet has grown. A lot of this isn't necessary. It's necessary because we keep increasing the gap of the haves and the have-nots, and we always want more. And so we need to think about that as a planet, but we each need to think about that in our own lives. Of course, it's complicated. I mean, I think it's probably true in any field and in any conversation today, but I do have to say, when you talk to lawyers, they always say, like, that's the answer to everything. If you have a question, they're like, it's complicated, but it is complicated. Some of this environmental devastation is simply natural. A lot of it is caused by us setting the balance off. When you think about the fact that the rural population on the planet, the global rural population, 60 to 80% of the African population still lives in rural areas. Most of them are subsistence farmers. Most of them are not, don't have the resources and don't have the wherewithal to live through a drought, to make it and keep farming their land through one environmental disaster after another. 40% of the global population is still rural. It's smaller in the Americas because so many people have already migrated to coastal cities. And so I was thinking about some of the people I've met across the time. Jose Domingo, that I told you about. Zam, who is not climate displacement related, but came to our southern border to ask for asylum after she fled political persecution and in fact lost her sister and brother-in-law in an attack that was meant for her. America, an indigenous young woman whose family was subsistence farming until she had to flee ethnic and gender violence. And Jordi, who's a young Nicaraguan that was standing up for what he believed in a political climate that didn't make that possible. So the work we do, of course, because it's complicated, is a balance of people that have either fled environmental and climate displacement or political realities. A lot of the political realities might have come originally from climate displacement. Think about it. If you're a farmer in Africa and you have to leave your farmland and migrate to the city, your first move is to the city. In the city, there might not be jobs. Things are difficult. You suffer. There's more, you're much more vulnerable to domestic violence, to organized crime violence. Some of those things are the thing that finally triggers the move to another country and can be the trigger of what causes somebody to end up at our southern border. And so, yes, we as a nation, for those of us who are from the United States, need to figure out how to more appropriately be hospitable and welcome and respect the laws that we've committed to. But we also need to figure out how to make a world where people don't have to make those choices to flee. Pope Francis is in Nigeria right now. First time in 40 years that he's been to Nigeria, and considering that the average age in that country is probably under 20, they said most people never lived through a papal visit. But Pope Francis was extremely prophetic yesterday in Nigeria. He condemned, I'm going to quote him, but he condemned economic colonialism in Africa, saying terrible forms of exploitation unworthy of humanity. Sorry, he's not in Nigeria. He's in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Terrible forms of exploitation unworthy of humanity in Congo, where vast mineral wealth has fueled war, displacement, and hunger. And he said, hands off the Democratic Republic of Congo. Hands off Africa. Stop choking Africa. It is not a mine to be stripped or a terrain to be plundered. An estimated 5.7 million people are internally displaced in Congo, and 26 million face severe hunger. Clearly, some people are going to make the choice for hope, for better chances, for freedom or safety in another country. Laudato Si talks a lot about climate change, but climate change is a huge piece of what fuels migration and what causes people to arrive here in El Paso at our southern border. Many of the poor, I'm just going to read the part that's highlighted. Many of the poor live in areas particularly affected by phenomena related to warming, and their means of subsistence are largely dependent on natural resources and ecosystemic services such as agriculture, fishing, and forestry. They have no other financial activities or resources which can enable them to adapt to climate change or to face natural disasters. And their access to social services and protection is very limited. Migration is after people have been failed many, many times. So the border reality is a product of human-provoked climate crises and nature-provoked climate crises. Failure of government of origin to provide structure and safety nets. Economic and internal policies that aim to exploit labor and resources of countries with less protective regulations, which causes poverty, organized crime, and forces migration. And so I wonder, willful ignorance and blindness is still ignorance. How do we look at labels? How do we make conscious decisions? Pope Francis says, no one will ever openly deny that refugees are human beings. Yet in practice, by our decisions and the way we treat them, we can show that we consider them less worthy, less important, less human. We are called to action. We're called to change our lives. What would it take to make you leave your home, your family, your community, your land, your culture and customs, your language, your food? What would it take? Hope? A threat to your life? A threat to your family? Desire for more for your children? The loss of loved ones to violence, environmental disaster? And so I stop here to say, what do I have to change? What does each one of us have to change? Yes, we need to change national policies. Yes, we need to change institutions. We have to start in our own lives. Who is affected by the fact that I have blueberries year round? I'm talking about me now. Who's affected so that I can pay $20 for a pair of blue jeans at Kohl's? Who's affected because I want to get my new tea kettle that I ordered on a specific online ordering system? I want it tomorrow. How do I stop getting caught up in buying new clothes because I deserve a treat, because I'm bored with what I have? Do I really need a new cell phone or a new TV? All of these things contribute to exploitation of land, exploitation of people, and non-living wages. Every one of us is called to adopt simpler lifestyles. being more serious or more sober about our use of resources and energy, avoiding single-use plastic, adopting a more plant-based diet so they don't have to deforest the Amazon, and reducing our meat consumption, using public transportation more. Let's live with enough and make the world sustainable. Let's figure out how to be less about more and more about sharing. I know I'm saying some hard things to provoke us, to challenge us, but the gospel calls us to action, right? And the gospel calls us to change and to share. Pope Francis talks about the globalization of indifference, and he talks about the opposite, solidarity in the culture of encounter. So I just ask, how does each of us live more consistently and challenge each other in a way that does not judge or shut people down, but starts from the presumption of goodwill and the drive to do better, or the desire to listen and understand, because we happen to be really good at prejudging people. I pray every day for a better world, but I also pray for patience and courage to hear what I need to hear and do what I need to do. I'm just going to throw this, I'm not going to read this last slide because I think I'm out of time, but as I was reading stuff for today, I came across this term called ecological economics, which I found fascinating because it is literally about the whole like economy of enough and moving away from consumption driven, power driven, accumulation driven motivation. So the southern border is the tip of the iceberg. And we have to figure out how to walk it back and make it so people don't have to arrive here unless they want to, not because they have to. Thanks. Oh, sorry. And Mary asked me to talk about Las Americas. Las Americas is an amazing organization. Let me just say that here in El Paso, where both Deirdre and I work, that is mostly people from here in El Paso that are mostly women, that are driven by justice and care for community and their neighbors, and does hands-on assistance with asylum, citizenship, justice. Jump in, Deirdre, and add anything else you want to add. But it's an organization right here in El Paso.
Latina, founded and led around the same time and by some of the same people as Annunciation House, and doesn't take government money. So, and to prioritize the value of staying very close to the people. Thanks, Heidi.
Thanks.
Thank you, Heidi. Yes, an amazing challenge to us to share, reduce. Thank you for your talk. I'm also looking forward to our next speaker, who has a little bit of a different approach than our first two speakers. So Dr. Anthony Pino is an instructor of English, composition, literature, and critical thinking. He's a published poet and writer. He will talk about the roots of compassion in Islam, the commitment to displaced humanity. Thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Pino. I look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Mary. You're very generous. I have been studying Islam, and I've got a long way to go, frankly speaking. But and when I was asked about having a discussion or giving a presentation on the southern border crisis, I had one bald, brash question to ask of myself: what does Islam have to do with the border crisis? Well, I found some connections, and I'd like to go through those with you. First, American attitudes toward immigration need to be informed by Islamic thought as well as Judeo-Christian thought. The Muslim presence in the United States is approximately 3 million members. However, it is growing at a very fast rate. According to the Pew Research Center, by 2040, Muslims will replace Jews as the nation's second largest religious group after Christians. And by 2050, the US Muslim population is projected to reach 8.1 million members, or 2.1 of the nation's total population, nearly twice the share of today. Okay. The American connection. Islam has deep roots in United States history. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were among its supporters. Jefferson was an activist for freedom of religion and espoused freedom of religious practice for Jews, Muslims, and what he called pagans. While critical of Islam and Catholicism for connecting church and state, Jefferson celebrated the right of free citizens to practice these faiths. Interestingly, both Jefferson and his inspiring British philosopher John Locke owned copies of the Quran. Like many landowning citizens, George Washington owned slaves, some of whose roots were Islamic, a quality reflected in their names, dress, rituals, and dietary laws. Washington's rapport with his slaves, including his Islamic slaves, was known to be respectful and evolved for his time, and he freed them in his will. To be truthful, occasional physical punishments were inflicted upon slaves who transgressed the rules of servitude at Mount Vernon. Speaking more broadly, one historian puts the issue of Islam in America in this way. It is clear that the founding fathers thought about the relationship of Islam to the new nation and were prepared to make a place for it in the Republic. One scholar recounted that supporting Jefferson was his old ally, Richard Henry Lee, who made a motion in Congress on June 7, 1776, that the American colonies declare independence. True freedom, Lee asserted, embraces the Mohammedan and the Gentoo, which means Hindu, as well as the Christian religion. We often forget that Muhammad himself, peace be upon him, encouraged immigration of his own tribe to Africa for the protection of the Christian king of Ethiopia, then Abyssinia, Negus, who had a reputation for fairness and compassion. Negus and his subjects rejected pleas and bribes from envoys of Mecca who wanted the Muslims returned to prevent the rise of a competing regional power. As part of the Muslim discourse, Jafar, the Muslim spokesperson, demonstrated a deep knowledge of the Christian New Testament, a sign of respect for Negus's Christian community. Another lesson learned from this episode is that humanity must recognize oppressive powers which victimize vulnerable communities, just as Muhammad did. Muhammad, peace be upon him, himself was an immigrant refugee when he had to flee from Mecca, where Muslims were poorly treated and starved, to Medina, where favorable brotherly treatment and integration opportunities were negotiated for Muslims. The Quran is rich with examples of compassionate treatment, anecdotes, and direction directed toward immigrants, orphans, and widows. The appearance of the words compassion, mercy, forgiveness, charity, and other synonyms and demonstrable acts are found in nearly every page of the Quran. According to my count, 483 such allusions can be found in the Quran. In today's society, compassion and generosity are inextricably part of the fabric of Islam. Muslims are, in the main, more charitable than non-Muslims. The Muslim ethos of compassion has begun informing American institutions and charities. The charitable ethos of Islam has taken hold of the American conscience, according to statistics gathered by the Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and other responsible sources. Muslims are gaining a foothold in American culture and society. Muslim representatives have been elected from Milwaukee, Indiana, and Michigan. There are also prominent and trusted national talk show hosts like Ali Velshi and Fareed Zakaria, as well as sympathetic entertainers like Trevor Noah and Ben Affleck, and practitioners of multiple religions like Christiana Amanpour. My conclusion, to reflect America's changing social dynamics, its border policies should integrate Islamic thought and ethos, along with those of other major faiths. Such policies as the family separation practices are morally reprehensible and must be rejected. Responsible policies to rationally, systematically, and compassionately adjudicate immigration on our southern borders must be adopted. I have made mission visits to El Salvador, El Paso, and Juarez, and found that these are often dangerous places for good working families. U.S. policies should not further their life-threatening conditions. I just want to say that thank you for listening. And I do want to say that these trips to the southern borders, which I hope to make more of in the future, are frankly wonderful and very gratifying. And I think we all need to be heartened by the fact that Pope Francis met with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar in Egypt, and they both worshiped together, which included prostate leaning toward Mecca in Muhammadan in Islamic prayer, and both of them. And it was a very moving sight to see. So I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Pino. I hope that we'll have time to talk with you later on, because I certainly have a number of questions about the things you presented. One thought would be maybe we should include Christian thought in our immigration policy, but I'll leave that till later. Another speaker who I'm looking forward to hearing from is Catherine Davies Samway. Let me pull up her introduction. So Catherine Davies Samway is a professor emerita at San Jose State University, a writer and a freelance reporter. I even read one of her articles, which she will further illustrate in her talk. She will speak on undocumented immigrants in Oakland who say, "We live in a country that hates us, but benefits from our labor. We belong here." Welcome, Professor Samway.
Excuse me just a moment. Catherine, I don't have access. I have your slides, but I don't know if I have access to the screen. Oh, I guess I do. Okay, I'm sorry. So you tell me when you want.
So if you could put the first figure up, please, that would be great.
Okay. Let's see.
I'm going to start with some pictures of migrants either on their way to or at the southern border, where they are all presumably planning on trying to enter the US, where they hope for a life free of physical and or economic violence. Marita, do you want me to see if I can pull up my PowerPoint?
Well, yes, I'm showing the slide, but I don't know how to make it show to other people.
Excuse me, Marita, turn your
Yes.
video on. Click on Start Video on the bottom of the screen.
Start
Because we don't
video.
see you, we just see your name.
On the
We should be
left-hand
seeing
side.
you.
I don't see where it says start video.
On
I
the
see.
bottom left-hand side of the black screen that's surrounding all of the little boxes.
On mine is the second from the left on the bottom next to mute. Is that the one you're talking about, Mary?
Yes.
I'm sorry, but I can't find what you're talking about.
Let me try and pull up my PowerPoint slides and see.
Okay.
Hope that works. And I have to screen share. Okay. This might do it.
There it is.
Move that. Okay. Oops. Can you see 3 pictures there?
Yes.
Can everyone see 3 pictures?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so as I mentioned, I wanted to start with some pictures of migrants on their way to or at the southern border. And this first one up on the top left shows a group of people walking. And I think it's important to mention that many migrants voluntarily turn themselves in at the border and ask for asylum. And also, as Heidi mentioned, most people want to stay home. They need to have options, including that they can stay home. The second one is of migrants waiting at the southern border, and you can see how troubling this is. At that border, they often lack food, water, and a safe place to shelter. The third picture at the bottom there is of migrants caged in at the southern border, which was a scandal, quite honestly, when people got to hear about it during the Trump administration. And their asylum requests were often ignored, were almost always ignored. Isn't it moving? This is a picture of a group of migrants crossing the Rio Grande in Texas. And here they're hoping also to apply for asylum. And here is a young boy waiting at the border. And as our 2 previous early speakers mentioned, the wait can be months and sometimes it can be years. During the Trump administration, many children were separated from their parents at the border, as you may remember. And there are still quite a few children who have still not been reacquainted with their families. Now, imagine that you are a young person who entered the US with your parents and you're undocumented. You're all undocumented. Maybe your family entered on a temporary visa, perhaps a work visa or a student visa, and then they stayed on in the United States beyond their departure date. Or like these people who we've seen in the slides, you may have walked for hundreds of miles and crossed the southern border without immigration documents, having endured an exhausting, dangerous, and turbulent journey. And I mentioned immigration documents because they come with documents from their home countries typically, not always, but typically. You've lived in the US for several years now. You've been going to school where you've done well, and you've also helped take care of your younger siblings. But you are constantly aware that you're undocumented and fearful of what could happen to you and your family members if any of you are picked up by ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, the federal agency. For undocumented immigrants, including those seeking asylum, this experience can be incredibly alarming because if you are picked up, you can be imprisoned, often for many months, and or deported, and in some cases, possibly to a country that you may not know or may not remember, and you could also be separated from family members, including children. At the local library, you hear a young immigrant rights activist and organizer talking about DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And these are some of the features of that program. It's a federal policy that was initiated by the Obama administration in 2012. It was designed to provide some protection for young people who entered the country without papers. In March 2022, it protected over 600,000 young people. However, at that time, it was also estimated that almost double that number were eligible, but they had not applied. And currently, DACA recipients come from 29 countries of origin. The highest is about 500,000 from Mexico, and the lowest, at least when I last looked, was about 600 recipients from Indonesia. With DACA, recipients can go to school, they can work, and they can apply to travel outside of the US, such as to visit a family member, though that applying for that travel visa is not a guarantee they'll get it. However, here's a big thing. DACA recipients must reapply every 2 years, and it is not a path to residency or citizenship. So going back to this imagined young person, when you hear about the DACA program, your heart lightens a little, imagining that you can now apply for some kind of protection from arrest and deportation. You're optimistic and you look into DACA. However, you learn that in mid-October 2022, just last October, a federal judge ruled that the DACA program can continue, but only temporarily, at least until April of this year, early April 2023, when the Texas District Court will likely schedule a hearing. However, for now, new applicants like you will not have your applications processed. You can apply, and as far as I can tell, it costs about $500, just a little bit under, to apply, but that is it. Your heart sinks. This imagined young person is representative of thousands of young immigrants who are living in the United States without official papers. I guess I'll just continue with that. Sorry about that. I had wanted to get rid of the, stop using that that slide. I'm going to overlook these two slides. Maybe I'll leave it. Anyway, in December.
We do have plenty of time, I'll say, if there's something you would like to add.
Well, I don't want to take too much time from other people, but basically there are these myths, and there's lots of myths, and here are some of them. But before I go to that, I just wanted to say that in December 2022, an article I wrote about the contributions of undocumented people to Oakland was published in the digital news source, Oakland Voices, and I'll put the link in the chat later. I wanted to include the experiences and perspectives of people who come from different countries and had different immigration statuses. However, no one who was undocumented and not part of a temporary program such as DACA agreed to be interviewed. Even some people who have DACA were not willing to be interviewed for the article, even when Oakland Voices and I stressed that their identities would be protected, such as, them using a pseudonym, not taking a picture of their face, not taking pictures and including pictures of their car with the registration number, or their street name, or their house, or anything like that. However, I think it is truly understandable why they would be reluctant to be interviewed. Because even in California and relatively progressive Bay Area, there's a lot of hostility directed at immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants. However, I was able to interview some DACA recipients and also some advocates for migrants and immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants. And I'd like to now just very briefly share a little bit about these people that I interviewed, their experiences and their perspectives. This is Saba Nafis, who is unusual in that she is originally from Pakistan, and there have been relatively few DACA recipients from her home country. Her grandparents lived in Texas and they sponsored her family. However, after her grandfather died, her family ended up in deportation proceedings, which was very difficult for them. She said to me, quote, "It was a grueling fight for them. It caused them so many mental and physiological issues, years of going back and forth to the ICE office and being under supervision," end of quote. She pointed out that her family's experiences weren't unusual, as many, many families experience exactly the same. In 2013, Saba's family had a court hearing. DACA had been announced the previous year in 2012, and a Dallas immigration judge ruled that Saba could not be deported because she was eligible for DACA. So in 2013, at the age of 20, she became a DACA recipient. In 2019, she married a US citizen and is now in the process of applying for citizenship. Marrying a US citizen is one of the ways in which a DACA recipient can eventually become a citizen, but it often isn't an option for all kinds of reasons. For instance, you may already be married or you're in a relationship with someone who isn't a citizen. In the fall of 2011, before Saba's family had their court hearing and right after high school, Saba heard about Immigrants Rising, a San Francisco-based organization that helps undocumented people get higher education. She learned that she could go to college, where she eventually earned a PhD in mathematics. I'm going to put a list of important, I think useful, helpful organizations in the chat at the end. In 2012, she realized she had to keep sharing her story, especially because she wasn't a Latina, given how most people assume that most, if not all, undocumented people are Latinx. She said that having a PhD and being a scientist led to her receiving media attention. In fact, there's a PBS film that's focused on her story, which is now available on Vudu, and I'll include that link in the chat. She said, quote, "There is this perception that immigrants have to be top of the line. You have to have a certain amount of merit in order to qualify to be Americans, to call yourself Americans. And I think that's really wrong. For example, you're a restaurant worker, your waiter, your cleaning crew. We tend to overlook them, to disregard their contributions and their humanity. I think it's important to note that we are all of us in this together." Another person whom I interviewed was Reina Maldonado, who is a restaurant owner with her mother in downtown Oakland. She's in her late 20s. She came with her family to the US when she was 6 years old and was undocumented. When she was 21, she applied for DACA status. She'd been a young organizer, and at first she was very, very hesitant and reluctant about applying for it because she didn't think it was a permanent solution. Also, she was afraid that by applying, she would reveal information about her family that could cause them problems. She said, quote, "It was something that was really scary for me," end of quote. She waited for a year until most of her friends had received it before applying for DACA status. DACA allows Reina and other people like her to work in the United States, but only for 2 years before they have to reapply for the status. They can apply for a driver's license, social security number, and a work permit, which Reina has been able to take advantage of. For example, she's been able to apply for grants and loans and open up accounts. She said, quote, "I've been relieved to have that, but the hardest thing right now is that if DACA were to be removed, that would leave us without social security, which makes me really nervous," end of quote. Many immigrants, particularly Latinx, expressed concern that someone close to them could be picked up by ICE and deported. In fact, I think it was 200 American citizens born here and citizens have been picked up by ICE, and some of them have been deported. How are you deported to a country that you never lived in? But that's what they call it. And Reina said, quote, "It's very uncertain. We're not going to stop here. This fight is going to continue, and we have to push for something permanent, inclusive of other people that DACA leaves out. We're tired of having to deal with so much anxiety. We're tired of this program that excludes so many people, including parents who've lived here for many, many years." She also captured a sentiment that undocumented immigrants often feel and talk about when she said, quote, "We live in a country that hates us but benefits from our labor. We belong here," end of quote. I also interviewed some advocates for immigrants, including undocumented people. One was Sheng Tao. I don't know if you know Sheng. When I interviewed her last fall, she was Oakland City Council Pro Tem President and a mayoral candidate. She is now the mayor of Oakland. She is the daughter of Hmong refugees from Laos, and she supports immigrants, including undocumented immigrants. In an interview, she said, quote, "I'm a strong supporter of protecting undocumented communities. A lot of people come here, especially undocumented people, because they're fleeing violence, persecution, and financial hardship. Many come from Central and South America, she continued. They're the most vulnerable, and we have to make sure we're creating these safe spaces so they don't have to hide in dark corners. We need to be more accessible to them. And she ended with, I don't believe that any human is illegal. I just want to make a comment about this whole issue of legality, illegality. I came to the United States about 50 years ago with a green card. I married my husband for almost 50 years. At 50 years is an American citizen. And I was called a legal alien. And I just hate that term. And I wish the federal government would stop using it and use more respectful terminology. Going back to Sheng, she also commented on how undocumented people contribute economically to Oakland. Quote, there's a lot that's been given back to the city of Oakland by undocumented people. I think that people are fearful that others are taking our jobs and opportunities. People talk about them taking resources, but actually that's not the case. They're also spending money in the city, just like any other neighbor. And there is as a link to a study that actually the Cato Institute did, that the Carnegie Foundation of New York published, called 15 Myths About Immigrants. I also interviewed another strong advocate for immigrants, Francisco Herrera. He is a local musician, co-manager of a day laborer and women's program, and a social justice activist. And he knows very well how undocumented people contribute to Oakland's economy. He said, quote, the day laborers and domestic workers with whom I work, the majority of funds that they earn here are spent here in Oakland, locally, on food, buying clothes, buying school supplies for their children, going to the coffee shop, going to a show. People have spent years here paying rent and lights. Immigrants are a central piece to the economic health of Oakland. Francisco also commented on how a large number of new businesses are started by immigrants and how California leads in this. He added, quote, they come with fervor, ingenuity, and energy, end of quote. I'm about to speak about something that I think it was Anthony commented on in regards to the Ukrainian immigrants. I think it was you, Anthony, who mentioned that. It's been troubling to many undocumented immigrants and their supporters, including Francisco, how Ukrainians have been treated very differently from immigrants of color and immigrants who come with few resources. He said, quote, it's a slap in the face to see them put the red carpet out for the Ukrainians in front of the horrific suffering of Latin Americans and Haitians, end of quote. You may remember that soon after the Russian war with Ukraine began in February 22, about 20,000 undocumented Ukrainians who arrived at the US-Mexico border were admitted. This policy lasted until late April 2022. This was at a time when thousands of migrants from Central American Caribbean countries were denied entry and the opportunity to apply for asylum. And as I mentioned earlier, many of them had come specifically to apply for asylum. In contrast with the situation with Ukrainian immigrants, in September 2021, thousands of Haitian asylum seekers at the southern border, most of them Black, were denied access to the US asylum system. And I want to stress here that that is illegal by international law. If you're an asylum seeker, you have the right to have your petition heard. But that is what happened. And they were put back on planes to Haiti, where they were likely to encounter extreme life-threatening violence, possibly loss of life. California is not unusual in how it relies on undocumented people to keep the economy alive and thriving. It's been estimated that if there were a mass deportation of documented people from the US, as President Trump proposed, the results would be catastrophic. For example, in a study, in some research into the impact of such a program on mixed status households, that is, households where there was one person at least, who was a US citizen, and there was also an undocumented resident, right? So the two situations. It was estimated that consequences would be disastrous and would lead to several major consequences, including the following: plunging millions of US families into poverty, jeopardizing the nation's housing market, reducing the gross domestic product, GDP, and costing over $1 billion to take care of children who were left behind, not deliberately so necessarily, not deliberately so. And then I wanted to end with something that we tend not to hear in discussions about undocumented immigrants, and that is the role of US foreign policy and actions. As this chart shows, and I want to stress, this is not a complete chart and doesn't take us up to date. These are some countries that suffered from US interventions, and these are interventions around the world since World War II. And some countries have been interfered with more than once. And almost always, these interferences have been in support of dictators and right-wing governments and large corporations such as United Front, which is now Chiquita. And these interventions have typically been in opposition to democratically elected presidents and the needs and wishes of the local populations, particularly working class people and the poor. For example, if you see down there in 1973, Chile, in 1970, Salvador Allende was democratically elected to the presidency of Chile. He was a socialist, not a communist, he was a socialist. However, in 1973, with support from the CIA, there was a coup. Allende was assassinated and a right-wing dictator, General Augusto Pinochet, rose to power, which led to the disappearances and deaths of so many people and incredible violence that lasted many years. These interventions have often led to or supported civil wars. They've also led to gang violence. They've led to loss of income, huge loss of income, and also the internal displacement of large numbers of people. About the loss of income, when NAFTA was approved a couple of decades ago, the promise was that it would provide jobs for people in Mexico, and it wasn't going to hurt anyone in the US. Well, in fact, many manufacturing companies closed in this country and moved to Mexico. But also in Mexico, small manufacturing firms went out of business because they couldn't compete with the large international company. So it really, and that led to people leaving the country to seek a better life for themselves. Most people want to stay in their home countries, and I think Deirdre mentioned this. They want to stay in their home country where the language and culture are familiar. But when faced with catastrophic circumstances like those just mentioned, people often leave their homes in search of a more secure and safe life. And in many cases, they head for the United States. I believe our country should stop interfering in countries in ways that cause death and destruction and the displacement of people. I also believe that we need to welcome migrants and offer them ways to become document residents and eventually citizens. Our country would fall apart if we did not have undocumented immigrants who want to be documented immigrants. Thank you. And as I said, I'm going to put some resources and links in the chat in case you're interested in following up.
We look forward to the links. Professor Samway, thank you so much. Again, touching on what a complicated issue immigration is and how complicated lives immigrants have. I'll wait a couple of moments for your links. But I invite the panel to be thinking about what questions you might have for each other, since you are all so immersed in this area. Thank you. I'm seeing some of the links now. So Deirdre, did you have any comments for any of the other presenters?
Not off the top of my head at the moment. I think it's, I think the complexity is what I keep coming back to. And that I wonder myself, how do we get from very locally based right answers, which I think all of us are tuned into in one way or another, to more sort of intermediate level and larger level right answers. I really personally have been sort of shifting from looking toward policy and politics for those right answers to much more interpersonal and just community-based kinds of spaces. So I just wonder for all of us, you know, sort of where do we go from here? We're kind of coming out of a time where we've had to do a lot of deconstructing, I think, of policy and politics to start to even be able to think in new ways about all of this. So just wondering if anyone is maybe seeing any kind of sort of mid-level, larger policy kind of level potential right answers emerging. How do we not walk away from the big picture while we're trying to be very intentional about our local living?
Thank you. Other thoughts? Heidi or Dr. Pino?
I mean,
Well, first of all, I'd
Oh,
like
go
to
ahead.
clarify something. I did not mention Ukraine. I think it was Deidre. Wasn't it you that mentioned? Yeah, and I wanted that to be straightened out because I won't take credit for that. You know, people need to be educated, and I think that's the first thing. That's the most valuable thing we have, and I think that it can be done in a number of ways, particularly with using all the social media channels that we have in our modern society. But right-mindedness, it takes a while. For example, it took a while for America to start accepting, frankly, Muslim congressmen. You know, there's been threats on the lives of some of those people, and it's kind of scary stuff. But I guess all I'm saying is that the truth must come out, and must come out as quickly ahead as possible to be ahead of the problem and to be ahead of prejudice. I had to write a little note adding to my dissertation about Islam, about the issue of because of all the female protests that are taking place in the Middle East right now. And anyway, it was a very enlightening process where you need to start thinking about separating cultures from, you know, religious theory. And that distinction didn't dawn on me until later on as I did more and more research that there is a distinction, that Jesus Christ didn't send a messenger on earth to hurt people or harm people. In fact, he's with the Beatitudes. He said he took the opposite position. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who help others. You know, and Muhammad was, blessed peace be upon him, was the same. Took a similar strategy as he wrote out, but according to the story, was dictated to by God through the angel Gabriel. And the Quran almost 500 times says, be good, be careful, be sensitive. It's an amazing document. It quite stunned me when I read it, frankly. That's about all I had to say. Thank you.
And Heidi, you were about to say something.
Mhm. I think, it was in relation actually to the big picture and the work locally, you know, that quote, think globally, act locally. And I think, how do we not lose heart if we're looking at the big picture, you know, and we do have to do both. It's extremely disheartening to try to think about working for change because everything is so politicized. You know, the head of the commissioner for the United Nations High Commission on Refugees said at some point, this is not a humanitarian crisis. This is a political crisis. It should be a humanitarian questions that we're looking at, but we've made it political. And so, yeah, how do we engage and yet work at the local level where one, we know we can see change happen. I think that's important. Where we have community. Honestly, if it's not faith-based community, it's maybe it's a vision of the world that we want based community. But if we don't have community, we can't stay where we are and keep doing what we're doing. So that's one thing I'm thinking, even, thinking about what each of us has said. And since I can't see the faces of all the people that are listening and I don't know what direction to go, but I do believe it's in working together and in community and remembering I don't have the answers. And remembering somebody else's answers that are different than mine might be as legitimate as mine. Something that Deirdre said touched that in me, that reminder that we have to be open to hearing from people who think differently than us.
Well, and I think one way that we can doing that is recognizing what people like Marita Grudson have been doing with organizing these conferences, bringing together people with different ideas from around the world, working at the university that they're working with to bring people together. Thank you so much, Marita. I have an additional question for Professor Samway. She's going to say something anyway.
Do you want me to? It was related to the previous part of the conversation. I think we need a two-pronged approach. I agree completely with the need for a very personal human response to migrants, etc. But I also think there needs to be a political, and I'm not talking about party political, I'm talking about, I think we need to recognize the power that politics have on governmental actions. And that's not just at the federal, but at the state and at the local level. So for instance, here in Oakland, it is a sanctuary city. And I don't recall if it was a law, but something passed whereby ICE, the Alameda County Sheriff, whose name then was Ahern, could not contact ICE and to then come and raid people without documentation. And this gentleman, Ahern, was just a real problem, and he ignored those regulations. And routinely, police would pick people up, they would raid them. Our former mayor would, at one occasion, she alerted the community that there was an ICE raid in the making. And so some people were able to protect their children as well as themselves. But in the most recent election, Sheriff Ahern was defeated. And we now have a much more, when I say progressive sheriff, I mean one who is not going to be doing his or her utmost to deport immigrants. And so, Mary, did that have anything to do with your question?
No, but I appreciate that reflection. We've seen something similar to that in Portland, Oregon. I did want to ask you about, Marita told me that you have a book published on educating immigrant children. And I think this relates to Americans. Many of them are afraid of immigrants and say, well, if I educate all of these undocumented people, my children won't get decent education. But I wonder if in your learning about education for immigrant children, you don't learn better ways to do education in general. Just like when we started putting ramps on sidewalks for people with handicaps, guess what? The rest of us like these ramps and can profit by these ramps too. So what is your learning about educating immigrant children? How can that improve our educational system?
Well, I believe that we all benefit from interacting with, knowing, working with, and studying with people from varied backgrounds, not just immigrants, but just in total. So I think it's a plus. I think it's a plus to have bilingual, multilingual people. And I'm totally supportive of bilingual education, whether just straightforward bilingual education or two-way bilingual education, whereby monolingual English-speaking children study with often monolingual Spanish-speaking children, though there are other bilingual programs, including Chinese, Japanese, etc. I see it as an asset. I see immigrants as an asset. And I think we need to regard it that way. I'm also an educator, so I know that if you do not know how to work with students who do not speak a shared language with you, it can be uncomfortable. But there are lots of resources out there, and our book is one of them, if I can show it. I don't know if you can see it. I wrote this with two friends. It's called Supporting Newcomer Students, Advocacy and Instruction for English Learners. And one of our chapters actually does deal with the history of immigration in this country and also, political action. But the most of it, the vast majority of the book, is devoted to strategies, which I think should be helpful to teachers.
Thank you. Thank you. I see a question from our YouTube viewers from Manny Hotchkiss for Dr. Pino. He asks, what are some of the ways you see that U.S. immigration is prejudiced against Muslim immigrant entry to the U.S.? So again, more racism, which Deirdre brought up.
Yes, of course, under the previous administration, there was a flat out ban on Muslims for a time. And that policy hasn't since been enforced. It's been pretty much dropped. But a religious test is not part of the American ethos. There are a lot of anecdotal situations I've heard about and read about, including issues of people of the Islamic faith, of the Muslim faith, in their dress and in their way of being, and there have been attacks on mosques and things of those nature. And but immigration per se, there's a lot of anecdotal things I could probably dig up without too much time spent. But that's essentially how I see it. And I'm sure that group that supports a ban on Muslims, I'm certain, you know how it is with evil. It goes under for a while and it pops up suddenly. And I would attribute it to that kind of behavior, to that kind of social thought. If anyone else has anything to say, I'd like to hear it.
Dr. Pino, was mentioned when we met earlier that you spent some time at the border serving and being compassionate with immigrants. Was that related to your Islamic studies, or how did that influence you?
Well, that was the initial question. The initial question was, what does this Islamic ethos have to do with the southern border situation? And my response to that is that Islam, as do the Judeo-Christian and Hindu religions, also contribute to the idea of hospitality to the stranger, hospitality to the suffering, the idea of finding someone suffering and helping them out, as in the story of the Good Samaritan. All of that contributes, I think. And I also indicated that Muslims are statistically more generous than Judeo-Christians are. This is a very interesting finding. It was very impressive, frankly.
Could I say something, Mary?
Certainly.
One of the things that just struck me as I was listening, is that what you're all talking about is, I mean, in this situation of human beings, is tightly related to the ecology, to issues of ecology. And the ecological movement has really taken off in this country. And it seems to me that we need to bring both together. I know a number of leaders in the ecological movement, and it seems that it would be helpful to do a joint education on the interrelationship. Deirdre brought out quite a bit how our Holy Father is combining these two. Heidi and Deirdre use quotes from Laudato Si and also Fratelli Tutti, but bringing these two together. And I think the climate crisis movement is ahead of this movement right now. And I think if we could combine it in some way, that that would be effective. And I have some ideas which I won't go into here, but I do have linkages that I think would be open to this. And I'm just wondering how that strikes the rest of you, if you think that would take away from what the points that you were trying to educate people on, or if it would be a help and or.
I think it is one of the most constructive ways we have to go forward for a number of reasons. From the Catholic tradition, I would say that as a post-Vatican II baby, I would say that my peers and anyone younger than me have, for the most part, opted out of the Catholic tradition for what I would describe as all the right reasons, because of a theology that denies the truth of us being part of creation. And so there's a tremendous opportunity for integration. And part of what really animates me about it is that there's also an opportunity, and I give Pope Francis a lot of credit. I think there's a lot more that I wish he could have done so far, but I think he hasn't shied away from those difficult institutional church questions that are really part of what dulls us to the deeper truth, right? If we can't talk about things like suppressing indigenous cultures and religion for the for the imposition of Christianity and Catholicism, we're not going to get anywhere. For me, that's one of the most rich parts of being here at the border, and being back and forth to Mexico every once in a while, and to walk again in the complexity of this moment, to walk into a church in Michoacan and see these indigenous women on their knees in this tiny little Franciscan convent at the top of a mountain, and they're praying for the forgiveness of their sins in their indigenous dress, on their knees, backing out from the altar. And I just, it just puts it right there for me, that the wrong people are asking for forgiveness here. And how do we get better at just helping those scales to fall away from our eyes in those larger institutional settings? And I know that for me personally, as the child of Irish immigrant parents, my own beginning sense of a Celtic understanding of creation and of God has been what has carried me throughout, to be able to find those thin little threads of right relationship with an otherwise very patriarchal and abusive institution. And to what you said too, Anthony, about sacramentality, I think that's also a common ground when we talk about creation and we talk about some of our faith traditions, that lived experience of divinity is ultimately, I think, what will help us heal and to move forward. The more that we can talk with each other about that and create opportunities for people to experience that without all the baggage. So.
I was also thinking about humility, and that not just as a religious question, but humility, because we now live in this time where many of us kind of feel all powerful, like I can do what I want when I want. And we can't, like we think we can, right? And the environment sometimes comes back and reminds us that we can't, you know, when there's a freeze or a hurricane or a flood or things that were not part of my schedule. So I think there's that piece as far as being part of this community. But I also think it goes back to something you just said, Deirdre, reminded me of this. Like when we talk about racism, at least in this country, you know, I'm pretty sure most people I talk to think racism is a bad thing and would be like, of course, I don't think racism is a good thing. That's very different than me then saying, what do I need to do to change that? Right? What do I need to do to let go of, but I earned this, or I worked hard, or, you know, or I deserved this, or whatever, when whatever that this is makes it impossible for other people to have dignified lives. And so I some of it in our churches, in our communities, and I think it's also connected to environmental questions, is us sitting down with people who think differently than we do, who pray differently than we do, who don't pray, you know, and learning humbly how much the world is not in my control. But I also think it's them learning what I need to let go of to make the world better for everyone. You know, of course, racism is bad, but well, I don't want to have to give up being first in line, or I don't want to have to, you know, getting something from my parents when they die. I don't want, I mean, there's so many ways, and it's not bad people. I think that's the thing, right? I have to say, and then I'll shut up. But like one of my big goals these last years has been presumption of good intention. Like most of us aren't bad people, but it doesn't mean we don't need to change.
Thank you.
Me and
Thank
Michael
you.
Jackson think I need to start with the man or woman in the mirror. I'm not going to sing. You'll be happy to know that.
Well, although you have given us things that we need to do and things we need to think about, there's also practical things going on that both you and Deirdre are involved in. And Professor Samway asked for a little bit more information about the legal work that you do. I know, you know, getting down to dirty details as opposed to big thoughts about how we should change our lives. What can you share about that, about some of your successes or frustrations, or what is the role of Los Americas?
I guess one piece
how do
that
they
I
help
would
people?
offer.
Actually, can I, my
coming out
question, could you please talk about the legal work that you do at the border? That to me is fascinating, that you're both lawyers, right? Or have a legal background. And I'm curious, you know, as to what you're able to do at the border legally. I don't mean what you can do legally at the border, but what you can do in the legal framework to support immigrants. Want to clarify
And
that?
I would, well, what does justice demand at the border, legal or illegal, right?
It's really about
I guess
your
I would just offer, yeah, I would just offer one glimpse into the situation right now with such large people coming from Venezuela. And it really illustrates the reality that our legal construct, particularly around the concept of asylum, was created 50, 60, 70 years ago that just doesn't adequately address the reality that people are fleeing, or the reasons why they're coming to the United States. And at the same time, it is one of the few potential tools that is available proceedings, is to say that I have a legitimate fear of returning to my country. I want to apply for asylum. And that is real for a lot of people. The challenge is that once you really get into the details of the legal construct of asylum, that fear, that either experienced or fear of persecution, has to be based on one of 5 grounds, based on your race, your religion, your nationality, your membership in a particular social group, or your political opinion. And unfortunately, those categories don't really clearly take into account experience like climate change and gang violence that goes unchecked by the government, and in some cases, even certain kinds of discrimination against people in various places. So it's very difficult, and it is a justice question right now, especially because so many people are crossing the border without encountering immigration right now. So they are on the streets in El Paso, are now being welcomed into Annunciation shelters without any kind of legal paperwork that allows them to travel outside of Texas. So it's really pushing the boundaries in terms of how to accompany people. And part of what I've been working with Annunciation House to do is some general education for folks to help them understand what asylum is. And if people feel that they have an asylum application that they would like to file, to help them file that pro se, to file it themselves. Don't have enough to represent people fully here in El Paso. So a lot of what we try to do is help people take the next step. What do they need to do? What might they be able to do to get out of El Paso and get to join their families or their loved ones, and hopefully find some longer term legal representation. Heidi, I don't know what else you would name for right now.
Thank you.
I think it's also important to remember that the people that you're just talking about, like the people that I've worked with and represented, even if they're not in detention, which is our hope, they're still pursuing asylum. They still have documents that allow them to be here while they're pursuing an asylum case with the US government. And so when we talk about people like getting out of Texas to get to their family, the ones that we're assisting with Las Americas, our goal is that they have some legal means or an asylum application. It's not always possible. We're not going to help somebody make up an asylum case if they don't have one. But in a nutshell too, one thing I was thinking about is the immigration court system is different than the other court systems. And so there's a lot of bias in the immigration court system. And so there are resources, one of the ones that Deirdre posted in the chat, where you can look up, what immigration judges, what the likelihood is of you getting asylum if you're in New York, and what the likelihood is of you getting granted asylum if you're in Texas. And at one point, likelihood in New York was like an 80%. If you got all the way to an asylum hearing with the judge, you had an 80% chance of being granted asylum. And at that same time, if you got all the way to the asylum hearing with a judge in Texas, especially El Paso, it was a 5% chance of winning. So one of our big goals is to help people maybe file an application, go to where their family is, and honestly to get out of Texas where they have a better chance of a fair hearing. Las Americas represents people who are seeking asylum, helps people. Nobody should be in jail for not committing a crime. I mean, honestly, I might say nobody should be in jail, but nobody should be in jail for coming to the United States to ask for safety and asylum. And so one of the huge things that Las Americas works with is helping people who are stuck in immigration detention get out of detention, because how are you going to ask for asylum for an asylum case when you have no access to your family and no access to resources? 86%, I think, of people in detention don't have access to resources. How are you going to prepare a fair asylum case? So one of the big things we work on is just trying to help people get out of detention and have time and access to resources, which may not be a lawyer, might be online resources, at least in English or Spanish, and prepare their cases. We also work with people that might be victims of human trafficking There's special visas available, victims of a crime, victims of domestic violence at the hands of a U.S. spouse, U.S. or resident spouse. We have a team that has worked a lot with DACA. I mean, it's kind of stalled depending on, the moment. I don't know if that gives some of the answer to your question, but I'll just give one more. I know we're running out of time, but at one point, I helped a man who was from West Africa, and he had already been told, we don't think you have a case. We're deporting you back to your country. But he was traumatized in his country by officials. He was threatened by police, threatened by the community, fled all of that. And so when he sat down to talk to officials about why he was persecuted and afraid to go home, he didn't go into the details of his case because he was talking to people in uniform who were asking him questions. And so, we jumped on that. He was scheduled for deportation. We jumped on that and were able to get the government to reconsider what he was saying by getting more of a story out of him. And they were like, oh, wow, you at least enough of a case to go forward. And then he got released and went to family. And I just always think it's not right that that person happened to randomly get in touch with Las Americas. And 90% of the guys that were with him in detention did not. So we try to do a lot of advocacy and getting the word out in the community, doing things like this so people know more about the reality.
Great, thank you.
Yes, thank you to all of you. And thank you to all of our viewers and the kind words that were put in the chat, and for those who had questions. Thank you. Thank you especially to our speakers and for the wonderful work that you're all doing. So thank you to everyone who joined us on YouTube. In addition, can we give a special round of applause or thank you to our speakers? I know you put effort into preparing for this and took time away from your work. It's out there in the world. You are creating ripples that will make a difference. Thank you so much. And as all of us continue our journey of understanding and compassion, we will try and keep the things that you have told us today in our minds. I wish you all vaya con Dios.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Mary, you're a great facilitator. Hope to see you soon.
Yes.
Well,
I hope to see you down in Los Pasos and El Paso at some point.
We'll be here.
Yeah. No,
Have a reunion.
Yes.
What did you say?
Said we'll have a reunion.
well, the wonders of technology, we could do it. We do it anytime, any place. And thank you, Marita, for all of your work on this.
Yes.
And
Thanks, Marita and Gerald.
I see
Thank you, Mary.
Gerald's,
Thank you.
And the technical team behind the scenes, the gentleman.